Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thanks, as always, for taking the time to join us. Surprisingly enough, we actually have people who have come on site physically to do a lecture for us. So we are recording from the conference room here at the CGSR facility. And today our lecture series is with Toby Dalton, with Corey Hinderstein, and with Jane Darby Metten, all of whom are from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And they are here to discuss a recent task force report titled Preventing an Era of Nuclear Anarchy, Nuclear Proliferation, and American Security. This was a task force that involved three co-convening organizations, Harvard's Belfer Center, the Carnegie Endowment, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. I think they'll talk a little bit more about sort of the composition of the bipartisan members that they had, the key findings of the report. But this topic of nonproliferation is sort of one where there was a consensus for a long time. The conversations on nonproliferation have changed. There's sort of a new generation of policy officials coming in, a new generation of experts coming in the field. Some of whom for this is a new conversation to have. So this will be sort of a very timely report to get a briefing on. I'm going to say a little bit about the speakers. They all have very extensive bios. They've all done a lot of work. I'm going to sort of revise that down a little bit because there's three of them just in the interest of time. Toby Dalton is a senior fellow and co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. He's an expert primarily on nonproliferation and nuclear energy. His work addresses regional security challenges and the evolution of the global nuclear order. He's done a lot of work on South Asia. He's served in a variety of high-level positions at the Department of Energy. And he's done a lot of publications, including books on the topic. Corey Hinderstein is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she oversees the Technology and International Affairs Program, the Nuclear Policy Program, and the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics Program. She's worked primarily on nuclear strategy, security, and nonproliferation issues, and emerging disruptive technology of strategic consequence. And prior to joining Carnegie, she was the acting principal deputy administrator for the National Nuclear Security Administration and the deputy administrator for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation, and has also written a lot of publications as well. And Jane Darby Metten, former Bay Area resident, is a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment, and she is director of the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. Her research focuses on the design and implementation of arms control and nonproliferation agreements, with particular emphasis on Iran and East Asia. And previously, she was a research scholar at the UC Berkeley Risk and Security Lab, where we engaged quite a bit in a former life. So with that, sort of over to you for the presentation, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us at the lab.
You want to switch? Mike, thanks so much for having us here. It's always great to have a chance to come back to CGSR and Livermore and see many friends, some I haven't seen in quite a long time, but it's always nice to renew our associations. Really pleased also to have an opportunity to share the work that we've done through this task force, looking really at first principles of the challenge of addressing nuclear proliferation. We tried to do this in a way that I think hasn't often been done, at least recently. And I'll start by describing a little bit of the approach that we took and why, and where the group landed in terms of its findings on the challenge of proliferation. Jane Darby will talk a little bit about the recommendations that the group came up with, and then Corey will wrap us up with some thoughts maybe on the current policy context and how this fits in. So I think for us, the starting point was really an observation, and Mike, you alluded to this earlier, that we're at an interesting point for thinking about the potential for the further spread of nuclear weapons in ways that we haven't really had to deal with in quite a long time. I think it's maybe not hyperbole to say that we're probably at an inflection point, though we really could only see this probably later down the road. But after 8 decades of living with nuclear weapons, and more or less effectively containing that technology to relatively few states, we see a lot of movement in terms of technology, in terms of norms, et cetera, that is, I think, calling into question the continued viability of the strategies and policies we've put in place to contain that further spread. And briefly, and there's a lengthy section in the report that does the sort of landscape scanning, but if you look at the various kinds of drivers, you see increasing salience of nuclear weapons because of coercion by nuclear possessors, Russia, changing technology, both nuclear technology and enabling technologies and disruptive technologies. A lot of discussion around AI, for instance. Massive interest in nuclear power. I think just even in the last year, that conversation has shifted dramatically in important ways to the potential that now many other states would have nuclear materials, nuclear energy systems. Domestic politics in the US is obviously shifting, and in other countries as well, such that evolving views around the desirability of nuclear weapons may be a driver. Just as one example of this, it's not uncommon to hear in DC, kind of on the cocktail circuit, like, really, would it be so bad if some of our allies had nuclear weapons? Which I think is a really interesting idea that just, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have heard that. It was a very fringe idea. I think now that idea is less fringe than it used to be. Unfortunately, and I would expect that all of you would validate this in your experience, we tend to deal with these issues in very siloed ways. There's a community that works on deterrence. There's an adjacent community that works on arms control and nonproliferation, and there's some overlaps between them, but they kind of have their own acronyms and their own institutions that they worry about and so forth. There's people who work on nuclear energy. There's a smaller community here, at least in the US, but a larger one overseas that works on disarmament. And by and large, these different communities exist in ways that doesn't allow for an understanding of the connectivity and the tensions that exist between different policies and strategies for dealing with this technology. And so the work that we did was to try to bring these different silos back into conversation, to see the connections across them and the tensions between them, and to try to ask and answer some big questions about the implications of the changes that we're seeing. We framed this very consciously in terms of US national security. This is not a report about nonproliferation as such. This is a report about US national security and how the challenge of dealing with nuclear weapons fits into US national security. We assembled a bipartisan group, very senior group of former national security practitioners, not so much the nuclear nonproliferation nerds or the ayatollahs as some others have called us, because we kind of know what we think, but really the problem is not for us. It's largely for people who think broadly about national security and come at it from the military standpoint, economic security, industrial policy, et cetera. So we have this excellent group. I have a few copies of the report that you can see, and so the sort of third page inside lists all of the task force members, but it was people like former national security advisors Steve Hadley and Susan Rice. We had Senators Bob Corker and Sam Nunn. We had Rose Gottemiller, who was obviously Undersecretary in the State Department, but then Deputy Secretary General at NATO, and Michael Morrell, who was the Deputy Director of the CIA, just really experienced people who've worked these challenges from a number of different angles in government to help us think through these challenges. We took a bottom-up approach. We basically said, let's sort of do away with the assumptions about where we are and why we are where we are, the tools that we've had. Let's think about where we want to be and what the various options are for the U.S. going forward. And come up with ideas that aren't really just for this administration, but for the next 10 years plus. So what should our strategy be given the changes that we're seeing? What are the guideposts for that strategy? And what are some ideas that governments, different parts of governments, could take on to move us there? Before getting into the findings and recs, I think it's worth pointing out that we inherit a lot that we all are familiar with today in terms of the tools and the institutions and so forth that kind of define the nuts and bolts of our managing of the challenges associated with proliferation. And notwithstanding the desire for efficiency and renewal and so forth, I think we have to be pretty clear that those tools are ephemeral. We see some decay across the tools and the norms, and yet, if we were to do away with them, they don't come back. Right? And so that was, I think, a pretty clear starting point for us, is that we need to consider how to do things differently. We take advantage of the tools that we have, but we need to adapt for a very different era. Uh, we discussed several different options, ranging from a very strict approach to preventing proliferation, as in like try to lock down all technology and all materials and be very almost militaristic in trying to prevent proliferation by any other state. We looked at the opposite end of the spectrum of, well, maybe we should assist U.S. allies to have nuclear weapons to the extent that that might help attenuate some of the challenges that we see, rebalance defense relationships and reduce our burden overseas and so forth, and options in between. Where the group came down is in several different principles, and I'll list them. So one, any further nuclear proliferation, friend or foe, would diminish U.S. power and influence in the world and create additional uncertainty in an already pretty uncertain environment. Second, more states with nuclear weapons probably increases the risks that nuclear weapons will be used. Third, any effort to prevent proliferation is more likely to succeed if we're doing it with partners and backed by principles and institutions that look across these problems rather than on a case-specific approach. And that if we anchor that strategy in big institutions, we're more likely to have greater effect. Third, this isn't, maybe I'm on 4 now, I forgot my numbering. Fourth, we need to think harder in particular about the allied problem. That apart from Iran, the most likely future proliferators and where you see a lot of discussion about the potential desirability of nuclear weapons are all in U.S. allies or partner states. Next, we need to think through how we modernize and strengthen the various institutions and tools. These will be more effective and potentially come at a lower cost if we are better and smarter about the partnerships that we engage around those tools. And those principles are essentially where the group landed on a consensus basis. We didn't go into this project expecting consensus. We hoped for it. We had people come in with very different views, including on the question of allied proliferation, or should we forward deploy theater nuclear weapons, et cetera. But we landed all together in a pretty coherent place. And so I think those principles are where we think the U.S. needs to continue to uphold. So how do we do that in a pretty rapidly changing world? We list a number of ideas and small steps to guide us. I'm going to turn it over to JD to take us there.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks to Mike. And it's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces here and be back on the West Coast having these conversations. I think picking up, the report itself is sort of structured in 2 parts, and Toby's just covered the first bit. This is the sort of landscape survey in some ways, and part of that is actually re-articulating the story of how we got the things we did and what are the different components, and re-anchoring that in a national security lens, which is historically how we got a lot of the things that are now a bit more siloed. Once you get to the consensus, the next question is how do you actually do this? And how do we preserve that lens as we sort of lay out the recommendations? And sort of the way we wound up going about that, Toby talked about how issues have become increasingly siloed. We kind of tried to dig it out of the ground and went from silos to pillars. And so this sort of strategic blueprint is structured across 5 pillars. And the goal here is to have enough of an organizing principle that shows how these questions and these issues intersect with multiple domains of U.S. strategy, U.S. policy, but also to be able to articulate some of the linkages in ways that are about consequences, but also in some cases about trade-offs. So how do we make visible some of the different sort of things that have to be balanced in any given moment when you actually are facing an individual case? And so to give you a sort of quick overview of what these pillars are, and we're happy to go into greater detail, the way I've kind of been thinking about it is the first 3 pillars are the sort of external facing pillars. And so they look at where do these issues intersect with the way the United States interacts with a host of different types of states. And pillar 1, going back to what Toby said, pillar 1 really focuses on the question of allies and partners. And so the way we frame it is, crafting a new extended deterrence compact with allies and partners. And this is speaking to the recognition that first, apart from Iran, a lot of the states that we're, the sort of like next states you talk about in a plausibility realm, these are states that the United States is either allied with or very friendly with. And that's not a historically new problem, but in a recent history, a newer thing. And that calls for a different set of sort of trade-offs and tensions. I think that also reflects the reality that there are questions about the nature of these relationships that are not purely about nuclear weapons. And they have implications for the potential appeal, but they are also being driven by other trends about, what do these relationships need to look like to be viable, including politically viable in the 21st century. So there's a couple of high-level things. I think that one, big sort of principle that comes out of the recommendations here is this idea of broadening the aperture of extended deterrence. And so when we have these conversations, we need to be thinking across nuclear and conventional. And when we're talking about sort of what is possible or what distribution looks like going forward, part of that reflects the fact that in the 21st century, conventional capabilities are more capable than they were when these relationships were formed. And so when we're talking about, kind of burden sharing or what responsibilities might look like, what could be sustainable going forward, that needs to be about more than just nuclear weapons. And so there's a sort of lot of focus on that. There's also, again, the perennial question of, what is assuring, but also the nature of dissuasion. So how do we make a sort of persuasive case that as these relationships are evolving, that the United States still has a vested interest in that these, sort of the essays that we see, proliferation curiosity is still more of a fringe idea than perhaps it might seem. And so that's, the nature of that, the sense of these alliances and partnerships are important for a lot of reasons, and that it would not be good for the United States if you see more allies and partners going down that road. And there's a lot of things we need to be doing now to address and clarify some of the sort of division of labor and what policymakers in Washington, what would be in our interests, and instead of letting that sort of confusion fester. The second pillar looks at sort of the flip side of the coin, which is, where do China and Russia fit into this? Again, historically speaking, the United States and the Soviet Union worked together pretty extensively to craft the institutions that undergird a lot of these principles, as well as to sort of successfully affect policy. It is not news to anyone in this room that looks very different right now. And there's kind of two main places. The first question is, what does the U.S.-Russia relationship look like? It's not just is Russia willing to play ball in this, but there are, actions that are actively pushing in the opposite direction. And so, just saying we need to work with Russia on these issues, that is not a particularly persuasive case to be making in this moment. And so how do we, be realistic about where things stand? The second question is China. And, part of that is, it's not just a two-power game anymore, but also China is coming at these questions from a fundamentally different starting point. We talked a lot about the Gilpatrick Committee back in the 1960s and the sort of galvanizing force behind the U.S. reconsidering these things, including the way in which it would work with Moscow on these issues, was China's first nuclear test. That is a different lens on these institutions and some of the principles, and that's important to keep in mind. So I think this was a tricky pillar in some ways because you have to not be too Pollyannish about where things stand, while also thinking about what does it actually mean to not foreclose opportunities going forward, and how do we think about the reality that there is still an element of nonproliferation that is a great power game. So what is that actually going to look like going forward, and how do we think about Beijing as well as Moscow and sort of where things are similar and where they're different. The third pillar is kind of, the rest of the world question, the everybody else. We talk about it as upholding the nonproliferation grand bargains, but I think what that really gestures at is the idea that global buy-in has been part of the success story. The reason that there are not more nuclear armed states is in part because other states have decided that it is in their interest to buy into these principles and these norms. The fact that most states don't want nuclear weapons means that when the number of states that do is smaller, you have fewer crises, and crises become more tractable when they do emerge. So there are a number of reasons why those bargains have been attenuated. There's frustration about progress towards disarmament. There's also, the promises of the peaceful side of that equation haven't necessarily materialized in ways. And so recognizing that there are real frustrations there, and also recognizing that it is in the United States' interest to have buy-in, because you could sort of see a continued erosion. And what that might do is that even if the sort of fundamentals don't change, it becomes a lot harder to actually deal with things. So a couple of things there. One, I think there's a real question of what does a grand bargain look like now? Does it look like the way in which we've thought about this historically? What do states actually want and what is possible? So part of it is calling for a re-engagement with key states to really understand those things, to get beyond the sort of trading of sound bites and understand what could make these things more robust and viable going forward. A second key thing here, and Toby kind of alluded to this, is, a lot of this is instantiated in institutions. And one of the sort of clear points that the group walked away with is that there is still continued value in institutions like the NPT, like the IAEA. And to lose those things now, it would be very, very, very hard to build them from scratch. So what are the cases that we can make to sort of affirm why they matter from the standpoint of US national security interests and as a force multiplier? But then the second bit of that is, how do you make those institutions robust for the way things look now and the way things might look in sort of going forward 5, 10, 20 years? And part of that is, how do you call for greater participation in some of these missions? How do we think about where budgets and capacity need to be? And that's a really important conversation to be having now, as opposed to retroactively when it becomes possible, when it becomes apparent that there are gaps. Another thing that comes up here, and of course this is pretty relevant, is, the group had a pretty clear consensus on sustaining the moratorium on explosive testing. That was one of the recommendations under this pillar. The fourth, and this is kind of related to the third, when we talk about grand bargains, part of it is nuclear energy. And this is an area, and this is a pillar that I think, from the sort of, call it the non-proliferation leany side, I think if that's the lens you come at it, this might be a bit more surprising. The report is pretty bullish on nuclear energy, in part because there's a recognition that there's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of things that are moving. And I would say in some ways, that's one of the newest domains, the nature of that interest and what is driving it domestically. That is a slightly different set of things to consider. And so, where the report comes in on this is a report of national security experts, not per se, nuclear energy experts. But I think that where the group wanted to weigh in was sort of two things. One is the recognition that in the US, a lot of this momentum is being driven by a slightly different set of stakeholders and primarily for domestic reasons, or in a lot of cases for domestic reasons. That has international implications. The way the pillar is framed is, revitalizing US nuclear exports to enhance and bolster nonproliferation goals. One of the members, says again and again, no exports, no influence. So how do you put yourself in a position? And so where I think the group saw the contribution here would be to explain how domestic things link to international things. And I think that that's in a couple of different ways. One is that it is very hard to persuasively sell abroad if you're not building at home. And so that's an important, that linkage is there. The second is that some of the things you need to think about if you're thinking about both exporting internationally, but also doing so in a way that is responsible and not increasing other risks, you don't necessarily have to do that if you're primarily thinking about data centers in the US. So how do we make sure that these things are not an afterthought? How are we thinking about this earlier on? What are the requirements for safeguards, for proliferation risks? How do we get that conversation happening now so that we're not in a situation where we're talking about costly retrofits later? And then, of course, the final one is, the sort of more sensitive bits of the fuel cycle. How do we think about making it possible for states to opt for pathways that both deliver on benefits that are needed, but also, don't go down routes that are a lot riskier and harder to draw back. And so those are kind of like key sets of questions that we think need to be talked about now and across different stakeholders so that things that are happening domestically aren't detached. And I think another place here is, the affirmation of there are ways for these things to be mutually reinforcing. And so this is not just a don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, but thinking, what are ways of doing this that deliver on a lot of different positive objectives. And then the final pillar is, I think, the kind of most inward-looking one. And obviously, being in the national labs, this is a really important bit. It's talking about, what are the foundations of U.S. leadership? Like, it's great to have a coherent, wonderful strategy. That's fantastic. But what capacity do you need to deliver on these goals? And that is, a really clear sense of that cannot be an afterthought. We need to be thinking about, who do you want to recruit and retain? I'm sure that a lot of people in this room have views on this as well. How do we think about making sure that, for example, in the technology space, as emerging technologies come online, what kind of capacity do we have for horizon scanning? How do you make sure that new capabilities are being turned into tools that serve these missions? And how do you make sure that the U.S. is actually able to execute what it wants to see happen in the world? And we think that that's, again, a really, really important people, programs, personnel, all of that is essential. And I guess kind of to wrap up, I think that a couple things that the group really felt were important. One is that this idea of, proliferation and non-proliferation should not be an afterthought. Like, this is not a thing that should be appended on to other conversations. This has historically been integral to U.S. foreign policy and national security policy from the get-go. And it's not a thing that should be added on or thought about later or dealt with in terms of crises. These are things that we should be thinking about cohesively from the beginning. And also the importance of maintaining bipartisan consensus. And I think increasingly as new people come into these questions, making sure that things that have actually worked pretty well in the past, that those lessons aren't lost and that we don't have areas in which the U.S. inadvertently becomes, a victim of its own successes.
Okay, so my job is to wrap that all up in a nice bow and kind of send us off with a little bit of a bigger picture. And I'll only do this in a couple of minutes. First of all, I just want to commend Toby and Jane Darby for the work that they did in the context of this. For anybody who's been part of one of these senior panels or a task force or anything else, and I'm looking at people in the room who I know have been parts of those things, it's not easy. And it's not easy, mechanically, it's not easy conceptually, and it's certainly not easy to then end up with a product that has real value. And I can say this because I take no credit or responsibility for this. I joined, Carnegie while this task force was already, way down the road, and I didn't contribute to it. So that allows me to say that this is a really good product. It's a really important product, and it's a reflection of a lot of work by people who were committed to, as Toby said at the beginning, setting aside some of their the assumptions they had going in and being willing to have real substantive conversations that reflected the moment. So, we have, and we might talk about it in the discussion, but there has obviously been a lot of debate about the resumption of nuclear testing since the president started making comments related to that, a week ago. And I think that there is one question that has come up in the context of that conversation that's relevant to a lot of what Toby and Jane Darby have highlighted here that the task force elicited. And that is a recognition that the United States has a lot more to gain by breaking the back of the current system than we have, has a lot more to lose than we have to gain. And I think that is really important because we often talk about the dangers of inaction, and there are real dangers and risks in inaction when faced with crises, when faced with changing environments. There's also danger in action, right? And so constantly thinking about those tensions is important. And two things can be true at once. The world of our partners and allies can flourish when the United States is in a position of influence when it comes to these nuclear risk issues, but they're not going to wait for us. And we're seeing that already. Partners and allies are making decisions that not only are reflective of growing uncertainty about the U.S.'s role in the world, but they're also durable. They're not making changes to wait out the next 3 years, 6 years, 10 years. They're making changes that are fundamentally altering their strategic postures and the commitments that they're making, whether it's financial, human, or political. And you can look at things like the Northwood Declaration and what the role that the UK and France are starting to play together to see that. So I give these examples because I think it's important for us to broadly think about what does great power responsibility mean in an era of renewed and escalating great power competition. What is the responsibility that underpins the role that we want the United States to play in the world? And that does have to do with nonproliferation, as it's been articulated so brilliantly in the task force. It also has to do with nuclear security. It has to do with technology policy and diffusion. It has to do with economic security and influence. It has to do with science leadership and investment. So it has to do with a lot of these different areas that, by the way, it's not a coincidence that if I relisted all of that and you thought about the role of the national laboratories, the role of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, it would touch on every single one of those areas. The task force focused primarily on nonproliferation, but the shadow of all of these other issues was there, and sometimes even more forward than others. And they are all areas of current debate whose resolution is unclear, and the role of our national security and science and technology leadership will matter to how those questions are resolved. And the last thing I wanted to say, after I've said all that, is to make very clear that these are issues that predated our current, political leadership and will persist past it. The task force, I just wrote a note while we were sitting here to confirm my memory of when the task force started. I knew it started before the election. It started last August. This was a recognition that the dynamics in the world are changing, and the U.S.'s role in both being influenced by and influencing those dynamics is extremely important. So this is, I think it's important for us, especially those of us in the room, and I won't make eye contact with anyone in particular, who've been in these conversations for decades now, to recognize that our assumptions are worthy of being challenged. Our decisions, it's not a flip-flop to change your decision when you are actually changing, informed by important dynamics and recognition of how the world has changed, and that the concepts that underpin our conclusions about our strategic posture are enduring but not immutable. And I think that's a recognition and a lesson that I will take from the good work of the task force, and I hope that you all will too. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I think that's a great note to end on. I just say thanks to the speakers for taking the time. Thanks for coming out to the lab. This was great, and I just ask everyone in the room here to join me in a round of applause.